Hello, church family, and welcome to today's Devotionable, brief devotions for busy people. I'm Nick Braun, and I'm the director of the college BFG with my wife, Abby, and we've been members here at Ninth and O for 16 years. Today, we're going to be looking at Psalm 70. Oftentimes in our culture, we're told things like, God won't give us more than we can handle, or God saves his toughest battles for his hardest warriors. While there might be some nuggets of truth tucked away in sayings like that, Psalm 70 is going to point us to a better truth. Psalm 70 follows a familiar structure of the Psalms, wherein David pleads out to the God for something, then is reminded of a truth about God, and then returns to his initial plea one more time. Let's read verses 1 through 3. Make haste, O God, to deliver me. O Lord, make haste to help me. Let them be put to shame and confusion who seek my life. Let them be turned back and brought to dishonor who delight in my hurt. Let them turn back because of their shame who say, Aha, aha. Here we see the desperation of David. People are seeking to take his life. They find joy in the pain that they can bring him. David asks twice in the first line for the Lord to help quickly. It is clearly a dire position. One of God's toughest warriors, the man who defeated Goliath, the man who escaped from many angry kings, is faced with a battle he cannot win. He even uses God's covenantal name, Yahweh, in verse 1, bringing to mind the promises of God to deliver his people. Then something interesting happens. Let's look at verse 4. May all who seek you rejoice and be glad in you. May those who love your salvation say evermore, God is great. David recalls the goodness of God as he does in so many of his Psalms. But this time, David's remembrance is focused on the goodness of God to his people and how his people ought to respond. There's a big shift here. The focus is not on David's personal struggle, but on all people who seek God and how these people ought to act. In a very personal, weighty trial, David is reminded that all of God's people ought to rejoice in God, not because of their current circumstances, but because of the salvation that God provides. While the world tells us to focus on ourselves in times of trouble, David brings in a communal aspect. He could have easily kept the personal pronouns of the first 3 verses, but he makes a marked decision here to point to all who seek and all those who love God's salvation. I think the implication here is that God's people ought to exhibit joy and gladness that's rooted in God and in his salvation as an example to those who are going through hard times. So verses 1 through 3 are focused on the trouble of the individual. It is full of pronouns like me and my. Verse 4 is outwardly focused, not simply on a personal Savior, but on a God who has saved an entire people for himself. A God whose salvation, in verse 4, demands all who follow him to proclaim forever that God is great. The remaining verse pulls us back to the issue at hand. But I am poor and needy. Hasten to me, O God. You are my help and my deliverer. O Lord, do not delay. David, now reminded of the salvation and greatness of God, once again calls out for help. His situation is no less dire than it was 3 verses ago, but David now remembers God as his helper and his deliverer. Quick help is still needed, but David is now focused on who God is, not the trial at hand. So as we face trials in our lives, some trivial, some weighty, we should remember that God does, in fact, give us more than we can handle. His toughest battles aren't reserved for his strongest warriors. They come for us all. In these moments, we need to look to those who seek the Lord as David did in his psalm. We need to press into our local church, to the brothers and sisters who have been given an even fuller picture of salvation than what David knew of. A salvation by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. When we witness this salvation and the joy it ought to bring the believer, we should, even in trials, be moved to proclaim, God is great.